The story begins, as so many dark stories do, not in shadow, but in the full light of an ordinary morning. Hexham, a quiet market town in Northumberland, England, wore the grey veil of a typical spring day in 1957. The roads shimmered faintly with drizzle, and schoolchildren in pressed uniforms marched in pairs along the narrow streets, their chatter breaking the silence of the cold air. Among them were two little sisters, Joanna and Jacqueline Pollock. To anyone watching, they were simply children, full of life and laughter. But as with so many stories that later take on the taste of horror, the ordinary was about to be shattered, leaving behind a void that no logic, no science, no faith could ever fully close. Their mother, Florence, had watched them that morning with the distracted eyes of someone who trusted routine. She had dressed them, braided their hair, kissed their foreheads before they left for Sunday school. Joanna, 11 years old, had a serious air about her, protective and motherly toward her younger sister. Jacqueline, only 6, was more playful, reckless in the way children often are. They walked together, the elder guiding the younger with an almost maternal devotion, a bond that made them seem inseparable, as if they were already one soul in two bodies. But that morning, the town's quiet rhythm was interrupted by the roar of an approaching car. Its wheels slick with rain, its driver not entirely in control. Witnesses would later recall the screech, the impact, the sharp cries of alarm. In an instant, the two sisters were struck down, their small bodies thrown into unnatural stillness on the wet pavement. Panic spread through the crowd. By the time the ambulance came, it was too late. Joanna and Jacqueline were gone, their laughter silenced in the most brutal, senseless way imaginable. For John and Florence Pollock, their parents, grief was not just grief, it was obliteration. The house that had once been full of sound became an echo chamber of absence. Florence tried to carry on, burying her sorrow in the endless cycle of chores and care for her surviving children. But John, her husband, found no such release. He became consumed with a strange and dangerous conviction, one that would grow more insistent with every passing day. He knew that Joanna and Jacqueline were not truly gone. Their souls would return. Reincarnation, a belief that sat uneasily within the Catholic framework of their faith, became for John not a theory, but a certainty. He told Florence over and over that their daughters would come back to them, born again into new bodies. She thought grief had driven him into delusion, and perhaps it had, but he clung to the idea as though it were oxygen. Months passed. The house grew heavy with silence, the kind of silence that presses on the chest and makes breathing itself a chore. Yet beneath it all, Florence carried another secret. She was pregnant again. The news should have been a cause for joy, a spark of life after such devastation, but instead it deepened the tension between her and John. She dreaded his certainty, his insistence that this new life would not be a new child at all, but the return of those they had lost. He spoke of destiny, of divine intervention, of mysteries beyond science until Florence recoiled from him, fearful of the obsession taking root in his mind. And then, in October of 1958, Florence gave birth, not to one child but to 2, twin girls. Their arrival was a shock even to the doctors, who had not expected a double birth. Florence lay in the hospital bed, exhausted, staring at the tiny wriggling forms placed in her arms. John's face broke into a smile that was not joy, but vindication. To him, this was proof. Joanna and Jacqueline had returned. Their souls had crossed the threshold of death and entered these fragile bodies. He named them Gillian and Jennifer, but in his heart he called them by other names, the names of the dead. At first, the twins seemed like any other infants, helpless, dependent, unaware of the storm of grief and expectation surrounding them. But as they grew, small details began to emerge. Details that would unsettle not only their parents but the wider world. Details that would later cause researchers, psychologists and skeptics to argue fiercely for decades. It began with birthmarks. Jennifer, the younger twin, bore on her body 2 strange marks. One was a thin white line across her forehead, eerily similar to a scar Jacqueline had carried in life. The other was a dark splotch on her side, in the same place where Jacqueline had a distinctive birthmark. Gillian, the elder, bore no such marks, and yet she carried herself with a seriousness, a protective instinct, uncannily reminiscent of Joanna. These were coincidences, perhaps, but coincidences that gnawed at Florence's mind. She tried to dismiss them, but John only saw confirmation of what he already believed. As the twins grew older, the coincidences became more troubling. When Gillian and Jennifer were barely old enough to form sentences, they began to ask for toys that had belonged to Joanna and Jacqueline. Specific toys, long stored away in the attic. One day while playing, they referred to the dolls by the exact names the dead girls had given them. Another time, Florence overheard them arguing about which playground they would visit when they returned to Hexham. The strange thing was, they described the playground near their old school, the school Joanna and Jacqueline had attended, but Gillian and Jennifer had never been there. More and more. Their words carried echoes of the dead. Jennifer would speak of a car accident with a clarity no child her age should have. Gillian would recall caring for her younger sister, repeating phrases Joanna had once used. Sometimes their games ended in sudden bursts of terror. When a car drove past too quickly, the twins would clutch each other, crying out as if reliving the fatal crash. Florence grew pale watching them, while John whispered under his breath, "I told you, they've come back." The years passed, but the eerie echoes did not fade. By the time the twins were 3, the family had moved to Whitley Bay, away from Hexham and the memories it held. But even there, the shadows followed. One afternoon, while walking down the street, the twins spotted a schoolyard and ran toward it with excitement. "That's our school," they cried, pointing through the fence. But it wasn't their school. It was Joanna and Jacqueline's. They recognized the playground, the layout, even the path leading to the entrance. Florence, stunned, asked them how they knew, but the girls simply shrugged. "We just do," neighbors began to notice. Whispers spread. Some called it evidence of reincarnation, others called it madness. And a few muttered about darker forces, spirits that lingered, refusing to let go. Perhaps even something malevolent wearing the faces of children. For Florence, it became a waking nightmare. She began to question her own mind, her faith, her sanity. Were her daughters truly reborn? Or had grief twisted her perception until she saw patterns where none existed? Yet the voices, the memories, the uncanny resemblances, they were impossible to deny. Science would eventually come to study the case, psychologists dissecting every word, every behavior of the twins. But at this early stage, it was not science that haunted the Pollock family. It was the feeling, gnawing at the edges of their daily lives, that the past was not past at all. That death had not severed the bond between parent and child, sister and sister. Instead, it had created something else, something stranger, something terrifying. A loop of memory and identity that defied explanation. And through it all, John's conviction remained unshakable. He began to speak of it not as belief, but as knowledge, a truth carved into his bones. The twins were proof of a reality that the world did not want to see. To him, their every word, every gesture was a revelation. Florence, however, lived in dread. The years between infancy and childhood were the most disturbing, for it was then that the twins' strangeness fully blossomed. Gillian and Jennifer grew in health and stature like any other children, but their words, their play, and their fears betrayed a shadow deeper than most adults could withstand. Their parents lived in constant unease, torn between denial and belief, between faith and the horrifying possibility that death itself was porous. One afternoon, when the twins were about 4 years old, Florence was unpacking boxes in their new home in Whitley Bay. Tucked inside an old trunk were several toys that had belonged to Joanna and Jacqueline. Small dolls with cracked porcelain faces, wooden blocks painted in fading colors, a battered pram with rusted wheels. She had not shown these to the twins, intending to throw them away quietly, but before she could, the girls entered the room. Their eyes lit up instantly, and they darted toward the toys with cries of recognition. "Look, that's mine," Jennifer exclaimed, clutching the doll that had belonged to Jacqueline. She called it by the same pet name Jacqueline once had. Gillian, not to be outdone, seized the pram and announced that she used to push it around when she was bigger. Florence froze. These items had been hidden since before the twins' birth. They could not have known their names, their uses, their histories. and yet they handled them with the familiarity of long-lost possessions. It might have been dismissed as coincidence. Children often imitate, often invent. But then came the arguments. Florence listened, trembling, as the twins fought over who owned which toy. But they weren't fighting as children newly introduced to objects. They were fighting as if they remembered. "That's mine, you know it." Gillian would cry. "No, it was mine before I died." Jennifer would snap back. The words hung heavy in the air. "Before I died." A phrase no 4-year-old should ever use, least of all in earnest. John Pollock felt triumphant. Each instance of strangeness was, to him, proof of reincarnation. He spoke of it with zeal, pointing to the twins' uncanny memories as evidence of what he had always claimed. Florence, however, began to wither beneath the weight of it. Her faith told her reincarnation could not exist. Her reason told her children absorbed stories and repeated them. But her heart recoiled every time she saw her daughters clutch each other in terror at the sound of a passing car, or when she overheard them whispering of things that no living child could know. One night, as the wind howled against the windows, Florence awoke to the sound of crying. She rose and padded down the hallway, stopping outside the twins' room. Their voices drifted through the door, low, frightened, eerily adult. She pressed her ear to the wood. "I don't want to go back there," Jennifer whispered. "I don't want the wheels to hit us again." "We'll be careful this time," Gillian soothed. "I'll hold your hand." Florence's knees went weak. She sank against the wall, clutching her chest. How could her daughters, born years after the accident, know about wheels, about being hit? No one had spoken of the details in front of them. She had tried to keep that memory buried, yet here it was, alive in their mouths. The Pollocks' lives became a series of such moments, each one deepening the chasm between husband and wife. John believed they had been given a miracle. Florence feared they were cursed. And outside their home, whispers grew louder. Neighbors spoke in hushed tones, some insisting the girls were blessed, others convinced they were possessed. Priests and ministers, when approached, offered little comfort. Some urged Florence to pray, to keep faith in God's mysteries. Others hinted that darker forces were at work. It was around this time that the case began to attract the attention of outsiders. First local gossip, then curious researchers, and eventually the scrutiny of men who called themselves scientists. One of the earliest was Dr. Ian Stevenson, a psychiatrist with a peculiar interest in cases of supposed reincarnation. His approach was clinical, dispassionate, yet the details he recorded in his notebooks would later send shivers down the spines of those who read them. He interviewed the twins, separately and together, noting their words with precision. When asked about their toys, they identified them correctly, down to the smallest details. When questioned about Hexham, a town they had left as infants, they described landmarks and streets they should not have remembered. Stevenson noted the birthmarks, the scar, the similarities in behavior. To him, the case was extraordinary, perhaps one of the strongest pieces of evidence for reincarnation ever documented. But even he, in his detached prose, could not hide a trace of unease at the uncanny depth of the girls' recollections. Yet skeptics remained, and their voices grew louder as the story spread. They argued that John had influenced the twins, consciously or unconsciously, implanting memories through stories, photographs, or suggestion. They accused Florence of weakness, of projecting her grief onto her daughters. Some said it was all a trick of chance, a series of coincidences misinterpreted by desperate parents. But the skeptics did not live in that house, did not hear the whispers in the night, did not see the twins flinch and shudder when cars passed too close. For Florence, science offered no comfort. Whether it was reincarnation, suggestion, or madness, the effect was the same. She felt she was losing her grip on what was real. Nights grew longer, shadows seemed thicker, and she found herself staring at her daughters with dread. Sometimes in the quiet of their play, she thought she saw Joanna and Jacqueline staring back at her from behind their eyes. The psychological toll was immense. John and Florence quarreled constantly, their grief weaponized against one another. John accused Florence of denying the truth, of clinging to a faith that blinded her to the miracle before them. Florence accused John of obsession, of dragging their family into madness. Their surviving children grew silent, withdrawn, unable to compete with the haunting presence of the dead made flesh, and still the twins continued. Their memories grew more elaborate, more insistent. They spoke of the school they had once attended, describing teachers and classmates by name. They recalled walks through Hexham, identifying buildings with uncanny precision. They reenacted the accident in play, one lying still while the other wept over her. To anyone watching, it was grotesque, disturbing beyond measure. By the time the twins were 6, the Pollocks lived in a state of constant tension. John embraced every moment as confirmation. Florence drifted into a hollow silence, praying nightly for peace, for the strength to endure. But no prayer could erase what was unfolding before her eyes. One particularly chilling episode occurred on a family outing. They were walking near a busy street when a car backfired loudly. Both girls screamed and clutched each other. As Gillian and Jennifer grew older, their resemblance to the lost Joanna and Jacqueline did not merely remain, it intensified. It wasn't only in their faces, though neighbors sometimes swore the likeness was uncanny, but in their personalities, their fears, their gestures. It was as though the past refused to fade, its claws sunk into the present, dragging these children toward identities that should have died years before they were born. By the age of 7, the twins had developed distinct roles, eerily echoing those of their supposed former lives. Gillian carried herself with a quiet maturity, watching over Jennifer, often scolding her gently for reckless behavior, just as Joanna had once done for Jacqueline. Jennifer, younger, was more impulsive, more dependent, prone to bursts of joy and sorrow that overwhelmed her. To their parents, it was like watching a play repeat itself. The same characters, the same dynamics, performed in bodies that should have been strangers. The memories they carried did not fade as childhood usually demands. Most children forget early impressions, their first words, their first toys. But Gillian and Jennifer clung to memories they should not have had, memories of another life, another death. Sometimes, when playing outside, Jennifer would grasp Gillian's hand and whisper, "We have to be careful this time. We can't let it happen again." Gillian would nod solemnly, as though she too carried the weight of that warning. Word of the Pollock twins had by now spread beyond Northumberland. Newspapers hinted at the story, dressing it in sensational headlines. "Rebirth in England?" one tabloid cried. "Twin girls claim to remember their previous lives." Skeptics scoffed, believers whispered, and somewhere between the two the family found themselves trapped. Unable to live in privacy, unable to escape the gaze of strangers who came to Hexham to peer at the reincarnated sisters. John encouraged it, granting interviews, allowing doctors and journalists to study his daughters. Florence recoiled, retreating further into silence. Each word the twins spoke felt like another nail in the coffin of her sanity. She wanted her daughters to be her own, not vessels for the dead. She wanted them free of shadows. Yet every time she looked at them, she saw ghosts moving just beneath the surface. The girls themselves seemed to live in a twilight between identities. Sometimes they answered to their own names, Gillian and Jennifer, but other times, when asked a question about the past, they slipped effortlessly into the roles of Joanna and Jacqueline. They described their former house with its creaking staircase and worn furniture, a place they had never seen. They named friends long gone, games long forgotten, incidents their parents had sworn never to mention. One day during a visit to Hexham, the twins begged to be taken to the park. Florence resisted, but John gave in. As soon as they arrived, Gillian and Jennifer broke free of their parents' hands and ran ahead, laughing with eerie familiarity. They darted toward the swings, then the slides, pointing out spots where they claimed to have played before. Florence stood frozen, her blood cold. "See?" John whispered triumphantly. "They remember." But Florence was not consoled. Instead, she felt only dread. What did it mean for her daughters to remember so vividly a life that wasn't theirs? What would happen as they grew older? Would they forever be trapped in this cycle, living out someone else's past instead of forging their own future? Or worse, what if the violent death that had claimed Joanna and Jacqueline was destined to repeat, pulling Gillian and Jennifer into the same fate? The townsfolk whispered, some in awe, some in fear. Children avoided the twins, calling them strange, cursed. Teachers reported odd remarks in class. Jennifer once spoke of her other mother and how she missed her. Gillian corrected a map of Hexham, pointing out details from memory that she should not have possessed. Their lives became a living contradiction, caught between innocence and a knowledge that belonged to the grave. By the early 1960s, the case drew further scrutiny from researchers of the paranormal and the psychological. Dr. Stevenson returned, making meticulous notes, publishing papers that documented the twins as one of the most convincing cases of reincarnation in modern times. He described their memories as impossible to dismiss, their behaviors as consistent with the identities of the deceased sisters. To him, the Pollock twins were living proof that consciousness survives death, that the soul carries forward. But critics sharpened their knives. They accused Stevenson of bias, of wanting proof so desperately that he ignored other explanations. They suggested that John had indoctrinated his daughters, feeding them details of Joanna and Jacqueline until they absorbed the identities unconsciously. Others argued that Florence, fragile and grieving, had done the same without realizing it. Some pointed to the plasticity of children's minds, how easily they absorb suggestion, how readily they confuse reality with imagination. Yet none of those critics had been there the night Florence overheard her daughters whispering about the accident. None had watched them collapse in terror at the sound of car engines. None had seen them identify toys they had never touched, or speak of wounds they never suffered. To the family, these were not mere coincidences. They were haunting, undeniable truths. The psychological horror deepened as the twins aged. At 8 years old, they began to struggle with identity. Gillian, more than Jennifer, seemed to resist the shadow of the past. She wanted to be herself, to live in the present, yet she was continually pulled back into the role of Joanna, the elder sister, the caretaker. Jennifer clung to the role of Jacqueline, both in memory and in mannerisms. Their arguments intensified, often revolving around events from the past life. "You promised we'd never go back there," Jennifer would scream. "But we must," Gillian would insist, her voice eerily calm. At times, Florence thought she was watching a possession unfold, not in the cinematic sense of demons and exorcisms, but in the quiet, insidious takeover of identity. Her daughters were being overwritten by ghosts of her own lost children. She could not love them fully without feeling she was betraying them, could not look at them without wondering who truly looked back. Were they Gillian and Jennifer, her daughters of the present, or Joanna and Jacqueline, her daughters of the past? Or were they something in between, a blending that defied comprehension? The horror lay not only in the supernatural implications, but in the human ones. If reincarnation were true, what did it say about free will? Were her daughters doomed to live out the same lives, to die the same deaths? If it was false, then what had grief and obsession done to their minds, shaping them into grotesque copies of the dead? In either case, the Pollocks lived in torment, and still the twins remembered. They remembered with the clarity of a wound that never healed. Their lives became a battleground between belief and disbelief, science and superstition, love and dread. To some they were miracles, to others monsters. But to Florence, they were children she could neither wholly embrace nor wholly reject. They were both hers and not hers, both alive and haunted by death. The case of the Pollock twins began to circulate in books, in lectures, in whispered conversations about the mysteries of the soul. Some spoke of it with wonder, others with fear, but all agreed on one thing: it defied explanation. Science could not contain it, faith could not reconcile it, reason could not endure it. And through it all, the twins grew. Their memories persisted, their identities blurred. But childhood is fleeting, and with adolescence came change. Change that would alter the story, though not in the way their parents might have hoped. For if the past could reach forward into the present, what horrors might the future hold for children caught between two lives? Adolescence came slowly, almost reluctantly, to Gillian and Jennifer. Childhood, with its uncanny echoes of the past, had left deep scars on their parents, and even on themselves. As they approached their teenage years, their memories of Joanna and Jacqueline began to loosen, like leaves detaching from a branch in autumn. What had once been vivid recollections, the feel of a doll's fabric, the corner of a park where they used to play, the moment of screeching tires, now receded into the fog of forgetfulness. Florence prayed for this. She watched in cautious relief as her daughters began to speak less about the accident, less about toys and places they had never known. The shadows that had stalked them seemed to be thinning. Perhaps, she thought, they could finally live their own lives, not as echoes but as individuals. Yet, the fading did not bring the peace she longed for. Instead, it brought confusion, even terror, for Gillian and Jennifer themselves. To lose memories is natural for any child, but to lose those memories they had insisted were real, that they had fought to defend, was like losing a second self. Jennifer, more deeply tied to Jacqueline's role, was the most resistant. She wept one night, confessing to Florence, "I can't remember her face anymore. I used to know it so well.
I used to see it in the mirror.
Now it's slipping away." Florence, choking back her own tears, told her it was for the best. But Jennifer shook her head violently. "No, if I forget, then she'll be gone forever. She'll die a second time." This idea that forgetting was another kind of death haunted the girls. For years, they had believed themselves to be two souls reborn. Now, with the memories evaporating, they felt as if their very existence were dissolving. Gillian grew distant, quiet, burying herself in books and studies, as though she could forge a new identity in the lines of ink and paper. Jennifer, restless and melancholic, often wandered alone, clutching a doll she had outgrown as though afraid of letting go completely. For John, this was a crisis of faith. He had built his certainty, his very identity, on the idea that his daughters were proof of reincarnation. He had defended it against skeptics, paraded it before researchers, even taken comfort in it during his darkest grief. But now, as the memories vanished, doubt began to gnaw at him. Had it all been a delusion? Had he projected his longing so powerfully that it had seeped into the fragile minds of his children? Or was this simply how reincarnation worked, the memories fading as the soul settled fully into its new body? Florence did not care for philosophy. For her, the fading was salvation. She begged John not to remind the girls, not to force the past upon them again. But John could not let go. He continued to press, asking them to recall details, to search their minds. The more he pushed, the more the girls recoiled, caught between guilt and exhaustion. By their mid-teens, the twins had developed a kind of dual consciousness. On the surface, they lived as ordinary girls, attending school, making friends, dreaming of the future. Yet beneath it lingered the residue of another life, faint but insistent, like scars that never fully heal. They no longer spoke openly about Joanna and Jacqueline, but sometimes, in moments of stress or fear, they would slip. Gillian once cried out in her sleep, calling for Jackie. Jennifer, during an argument, accused her sister of forgetting who we were supposed to be. The world around them had not forgotten either. Strangers still came to Hexham, some with notebooks, some with cameras, others simply to stare. They wanted to see the miracle, the mystery, the proof of life after death. Gillian and Jennifer hated it. They wanted to be seen as themselves, not as living relics. But fame has a way of clinging, and their story refused to die. By the late 1960s, the Pollock case was firmly cemented in the annals of paranormal lore. Dr. Stevenson continued to cite them as one of the strongest examples of reincarnation, publishing their story in journals and eventually in his book, 20 Cases Suggestive of Reincarnation. Scholars debated, skeptics mocked, believers defended. But through it all, the twins themselves were left carrying the unbearable weight of being both evidence and enigma. The psychological toll was immense. Florence, though relieved that the memories were fading, suffered from a deep fracture in her bond with the girls. She loved them fiercely, but a part of her always feared them too, feared the ghosts they carried, feared the shadow of repetition. John grew increasingly obsessive, alienating Florence, who often accused him of loving the dead children more than the living ones. For Gillian and Jennifer, adolescence was a labyrinth. They tried to define themselves apart from Joanna and Jacqueline, yet whispers followed them everywhere. Those are the reincarnated girls, people would say. Friends were cautious, boys were curious, teachers were skeptical. They never had the luxury of being ordinary. As they approached adulthood, something shifted once more. The memories did not return, but the dread remained, a kind of inherited trauma. Jennifer, especially, struggled with recurring nightmares of car crashes, of screams, of blood on the pavement. Gillian, ever the quieter one, kept her fears buried but confessed in later years that she often felt she was waiting for something to repeat. The horror of the Pollock case was not just in the uncanny memories of childhood. It was in the lingering question. Were they doomed to replay the tragedy that had defined their supposed former lives? If reincarnation carried memory, could it also carry fate? The answer never came. The twins grew into women, carving out lives of their own. They married, had children, and moved away from Hexham. With adulthood, the memories of Joanna and Jacqueline seemed to vanish entirely, like ghosts finally laid to rest. And yet, the story did not end. For even as Gillian and Jennifer lived on, the case continued to terrify and fascinate the world. Books, documentaries, articles, all told their tale, each time with slightly different shades of wonder and dread. The Pollock twins had become immortal, not as individuals, but as symbols of the inexplicable. Florence died still haunted, never fully certain whether she had raised her daughters or her ghosts. John died convinced, unshaken in his belief that he had witnessed proof of life beyond death. And the twins themselves? They carried on, silent about the past, but unable to erase it. For though the memories had faded, the mark remained, invisible but permanent, like a scar across the soul. And so the Pollock twins remain one of history's darkest enigmas. Were they proof of reincarnation, the souls of dead children reborn into new flesh? Or were they victims of grief, suggestion, and psychological imprinting, forced to live under the shadow of tragedy? No answer can be given, only questions. And perhaps that is the true horror, that some mysteries are not meant to be solved, only endured. And there it is, the chilling, unforgettable story of the Pollock twins. A tale where love, grief, and the supernatural collide. Were Gillian and Jennifer proof that souls survive death? Or simply the victims of desperate parents and an eager world? Tell me what you believe. Was this reincarnation, coincidence, or something far darker? If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.